There is a very particular kind of psychology that few people ever notice: the hidden inner world of those who have been through too much. They appear before others with a calm exterior, yet inside, there are places of weariness they no longer know where to put. People think they are strong, but they themselves know they are only continuing to live in the one way that has ever helped them survive. And then, on a completely ordinary day, something small happens. Not a crisis, not a sorrowful event, just a feeling that settles low beneath the chest, appearing while you're standing in line, picking up a piece of food, or responding to a familiar greeting, a heaviness passing through, brief, yet so distinct that you pause for half a second. You tell yourself it's probably just fatigue, but the moment someone asks, "Are you okay?" your mouth answers, "I'm fine," while inside, you opens a hollow space you didn't even know had been there. It's small, yes, but it follows you like a breath that never fully lands, slipping into everything you do. You begin to feel less patient without understanding why. Even listening to someone talk makes you want to sit down. You choose silence more often, not because you're avoiding anyone, but because every sentence feels like it drains another portion of the energy you're struggling to hold on to. There are moments when you sit in the middle of a lively conversation and suddenly feel as though you're watching everything from an unseen distance. People still laugh, still talk, and you realize there is a thin, invisible layer separating you from the world, a layer that's almost impossible to name. And in that moment, what hurts isn't the exhaustion, but the realization that no one in that room knows how hard you're trying just to look like you're okay. No one knows, and there is nowhere for you to set down even a small part of the weight you're carrying inside. You turn your face away, pretending to look for something on the table, just to hide a crooked breath. Silence becomes both a shelter and a cage. You don't dare break it, yet staying in it drains you more than the pain itself, because sometimes the most exhausting thing isn't what you're enduring, but having no one to tell that you're enduring it. You don't complain, don't cry, don't admit you're hurting, but you can clearly see you're no longer who you once were. A slight frown from someone can make you withdraw inwardly. A careless remark can keep you quiet for much longer than before. Life goes on, and you keep doing what needs to be done, except that in every small motion, a subtle kind of tiredness rubs against you. It doesn't disappear when you try to ignore it. It follows you in how you reply to messages, avoid gatherings, hold back things that could have been said. No one sees it, but you feel it. Something inside you is thinning. And somewhere along the way, you've grown accustomed to keeping everything to yourself. You are no longer afraid of pain. You are afraid of not feeling anything at all. And perhaps, from that very place, you understand that you have touched a depth of weariness beyond what any words could ever describe. There is something you only begin to understand after being exhausted for too long. What others call strength was never truly a part of who you are. It's something you learned in order to survive, like someone who's been cold for far too long, teaching themselves to sit close to a wall to block the wind. You were not born to be resilient, you simply never had any other choice. And this realization doesn't arrive in a moment of clarity. It comes from the times you try to look fine while feeling so hollow inside that everything you touch seems to ache. From the days when people lean on you, while you have no idea who you're supposed to lean on. From the feeling of always being the place others come to unload, yet when it's your turn, you don't even know which door to knock on. Then you suddenly understand, the calm you carry is not peace, but the habit of holding everything in before it has the chance to break. Your gentle smile is not joy, but a way of making sure no one has to worry about you. The way you step back slightly in every conversation is not humility, but instinct, an automatic attempt to keep your emotions safe. You begin to see each layer more clearly. The times you said, "It's okay," just to avoid disappointing someone. The times you handled everything alone because you feared being a burden. The times you closed yourself off because you'd grown used to no one staying long enough to truly understand you. Each of these things seems ordinary when looked at separately, but when placed side by side, a whole picture emerges. You have been living like someone who must lift themselves through every stage of life, even when you appear steady on the outside. And here is the hardest part to accept. Your strength is not really strength. It's a defense system you built after too many moments of having to stand up alone. It keeps you safe, but it also keeps you distant from the very things that could heal you. You realize you feel uncomfortable leaning on anyone, unnatural, expressing your emotions, unsure how to say, "I need help." Not because you are proud, but because relying on someone means you could be dropped one more time. Your heart has learned to shrink itself, so there will never again be a fall big enough to break you completely. And at that point, the truth becomes clearer. You are not trying to be strong, you are trying to survive. Your strength was never a light, it was armor. You've worn it for so long that you forgot that beneath that armor, you are just a human being who wants to feel safe, wants to be seen, wants a place to rest without having to stay on guard. Realizing this does not make you weaker. It opens another door to understand yourself, to forgive yourself, and for the first time, to allow yourself to put down the weight you've carried for so long simply because you thought you had to. And then, as you begin to see everything more clearly, something quiet happens. The things you once thought you had adapted to, the calmness, the independence, the strength, begin to feel tight, constricting. You notice you can no longer hide your emotions as effortlessly as before. The smallest things suddenly make your heart sink for a moment, as if the very second you pause for just a little longer, everything you've held together for years will start to crack open. You know you've finally understood the reason why. But in that same moment, you also begin to touch the pain that those reasons have been covering all along. The pain of this stage does not appear with sound. It begins as a tiny point inside you, a spot that stings the moment you touch it, though you have no idea why. You cannot explain why a casual remark tightens your chest, why something so small, being forgotten, being stood up, or someone's silence can make you sink so deeply. That feeling does not belong to the present. It belongs to an older version of you, a child who learned to swallow disappointments with nowhere to set them down. You thought those things were behind you. You thought you had outgrown them. But no, they only stood still in a dark corner, waiting for you to thin out so they could step forward. And when they do, you finally see clearly how you have been living all these years. You realize that long ago, just to survive, you had to learn how to stay silent when you were hurt. Learn to act understanding, when in truth, you were just trying to keep the peace at home. Learn not to cry when everything became too much. Learn to please others to avoid conflict. Learn to lull yourself to sleep on nights when no one asked if you were okay. You thought that was your nature, but as the cracks begin to open, you understand. They were only roles the child within you was forced to adopt for safety. It played the role of the good kid, so no one would be bothered by it. The role of the reasonable one, so it wouldn't be scolded. The role of the strong one, so it wouldn't be abandoned. The role of the independent one, so no one would see it needing anything. It put on each mask with trembling hands, not because it wanted to, but because no one ever gave it the chance to live any other way. And you, the adult you have become, continue performing the roles that child rehearsed for you so many years ago. You keep smiling when you're sad, keep staying silent when you're hurting, keep carrying everything alone, even when you wish someone would simply stand beside you. You've become so accustomed to it that you mistake it for your personality, until one day, something shifts ever so slightly. Something small, a disappointment, someone's moment of carelessness, a quiet second where you feel yourself drift out of the life unfolding around you, and your armor suddenly thins. It doesn't shatter, it simply thins. But it's enough for you to finally see what you've been avoiding for so long. You are not as strong as you thought. You've only grown used to compressing yourself. The real pain is not what is happening now. It is the realization that you have lived with a heart that was never allowed to be fragile. It is understanding that no one ever taught you how to be needed, how to be understood, how to be comforted. It is seeing the child within you still sitting there, silent, never once truly soothed. And that moment hurts so much that you have to turn away to hide a disrupted breath. But it is also the moment you finally see, more clearly than ever, what you have been living on and what you have been living without for your entire life. There is a very small moment, barely noticeable, that makes you stop in your tracks, a familiar situation, a reflexive response, a behavior you've repeated your entire life, and suddenly you see yourself with a clarity that almost startles you. Not the outer image, but the thin shadow behind every action. the shadow you've never dared to name. You realize you always say, "It's okay," too quickly. Always nod even when your heart feels cramped. Always shrink your emotions so no one feels weighed down by them. And then a thought surfaces, quiet but sharp as a cut. You didn't choose this way because you are gentle. You chose it because you are afraid of losing the people you need. A truth that shines so abruptly, it stings your chest. All these years, you have not been living as you wanted, but as you believed others would accept. You finally understand why you always soften your voice when asking for help. Why you smile at moments you should have been allowed to be sad. Why you step back so others can feel comfortable. Why you apologize even when you're not wrong. It's not because you are mature. It's not because you are considerate. It's because once, long ago, whenever you made someone unhappy, their love cooled just a little, and so you learned to bend yourself just enough so no one would leave you. When you look back and see that invisible rule clearly, to stay, you traded parts of yourself away. You trimmed off the lively, honest, straightforward pieces of who you are, turning yourself into a shape easiest to keep. No one forced you to do it. You were simply terrified of standing alone in an emotionally empty room. And when this truth appears, you feel a very strange kind of pain. A pain from realizing you endured far more than anyone should have to endure, and yet a lightness, because at last you see the truth you've spent years circling around to avoid. From here, you begin to distinguish the two selves within you. The survivor always alert, always predicting, always adjusting, and the one who still longs to live authentically, though it has been hidden away for far too long. Awakening does not make you stronger all at once. It simply places a question before you, one you have never dared to answer. If not to be kept by anyone, then when you return to your true form, who will you be? That question, if not to be kept by anyone, then who would I be? Doesn't leave you right away. It stays there, light but deeply rooted, like a small sliver of light quietly opening inside your chest. You cannot answer it. You realize you have lived so long in shapes molded by others' expectations that you no longer know which shape is truly yours. And when you try to touch that authentic part of yourself, you see something so clear it exhausts you. You have worn those roles for far too long to set them down gently. From this moment on, your body begins to react first. You feel yourself slow down at the thought of having to smile. Your throat tightens when you're about to say, "I'm fine." Your hand trembles slightly when you're trying to prove everything is still under control. And then, without warning, the role you've carried for years starts slipping off you. Not because you are trying to peel it away, but because it can no longer cling to you. When that shell falls, you suddenly see yourself with a rawness that almost frightens you. A feeling of exposure, undefended, as if standing in a room with no walls left. But what appears alongside that nakedness is painfully familiar. The child inside you is still sitting there. It does not blame you for wearing so many layers of masks. It simply looks at you with tired eyes, eyes that have never once been asked if they were okay. You realize how many years it has walked with you. When you had to act understanding in households full of swallowed words, when you forced yourself to be strong so no one would be disappointed, when you learned to shrink both joy and sorrow so no one would feel burdened. That child never wanted to be strong. It simply had no other choice. And now, as the layers loosen one by one, it steps forward not to accuse you, but to finally be seen, as if it were saying, "You've tried hard enough. You don't have to brace yourself on my behalf anymore." This moment does not feel like collapse. It feels like an exhale after years of holding your breath, like finally allowing yourself to stop. No more proving, no more bracing, no more being the calmest person in the room, just sitting down, letting the softest part of you sit beside you, not trying to fix it, not trying to suppress it, simply recognizing the thing you have lacked the most was never strength, but a place where you could be fragile. And in that moment, you understand. What you are letting go of today is not yourself, but the role you once wore in order to survive. And when all the roles fall away, you remain sitting with one truth you haven't yet dared to name. You have been profoundly lonely in your own life. There is a very quiet moment in a person's life when you no longer want to run. Not because you've become strong enough to face everything, but because you're too tired of pretending you're okay. It is the moment you sit down not to endure, but to finally look at yourself the way you would look at a friend who has been forgotten for far too long. You see the child within, not hiding behind masks anymore, not pretending to be tough. It just sits there, its small shoulders trembling slightly, as if asking, "Could you not leave me again?" When you look at it, something strange happens. The pain no longer floods you with the same intensity. It softens, as if simply being seen is enough to ease half of it. You realize that for all these years, what exhausted you was not the pain itself, but having to hide it so that everything would appear normal. You've always tried to control your emotions, tried to stay composed, tried to keep your life aligned with the line you drew for it. But in that moment, you stop trying altogether. You just breathe. And for the first time in a very long while, your heart begins to open just a little. You reach out toward that child, not to pull it up, not to force it to be stronger. You simply let your hand rest gently on its shoulder, not to fix anything, but to tell it that it is allowed to be tired, allowed to be sad, allowed to be afraid. And the strange thing is, the moment you grant that permission to the child, you are granting it to yourself as well. The parts of you that you once criticized, once wanted to discard, once labeled as weakness, suddenly appear so human that you want to hold them instead of pushing them away. You begin to understand that healing is not about removing what hurts you, but learning to sit beside it without shame, without trying to cover it, deny it, or silence it. Simply accepting that it exists, and that it exists because you have lived through too many unfair things. The gentleness you never received, you are now learning to give to yourself. And in that moment, you realize a very simple truth that once felt impossible to accept. You don't need to be strong to be loved. You don't need to be capable, calm, or kind at every moment to deserve a place in someone's heart. You only need to be real, to be present, to stop abandoning yourself the way you were once abandoned. When you embrace the softest part of yourself, the world does not transform instantly, but you do. You breathe more slowly. Your heart beats more steadily. You no longer tense up at every small thing. And perhaps, for the first time in your life, you are not trying to become anything other than who you are. This is the beginning of healing. Not when the pain disappears, but when you are gentle enough to stay with it without running anymore. There comes a moment somewhere along your journey when everything suddenly becomes brighter, not because life has become lighter, but because you've begun to look directly into the way you operate from the inside. You start to notice something you were never still enough to see before. Many of your reactions today do not truly belong to the present. They belong to the child you once were, the child who was never guided out of old fears. You realize you still flinch when someone changes their tone, even when there is no harm meant. You still shrink at an offhand criticism, as if it touches a place in you that never healed. You still feel your heart tighten when someone doesn't reply right away, as though the silence is announcing an impending abandonment. None of these reactions come from who you are now. They are remnants of the years you lived in constant vigilance. The wounded child within you is still at the wheel, still whispering warnings it once learned for survival. It doesn't know you've grown. It only remembers that long ago, a cold stare was enough to make it curl up. A mild reproach was enough to convince it wasn't worthy. A single abandonment was enough for it to believe that everyone eventually leaves. And because it believes this, it still tries to protect you in the old familiar ways, hiding your emotions to avoid being hurt, stepping back to avoid disappointment, shrinking yourself to keep the peace, carrying everything alone so no one has the chance to hurt you further. But eventually, you begin to see more clearly. These reactions no longer fit the life you have now. You are no longer the child who must hold their breath to read someone's mood. You no longer live in a home where your feelings had nowhere to land. You no longer need to make yourself small to keep someone from leaving. And the moment you realize this, the pain begins to change shape. It no longer stabs like before. It becomes a whisper. This is where I used to hurt, not where I still have to be afraid. You look at your reactions with gentleness instead of blame. You recognize that every time you panic or withdraw, it is not weakness, it is memory rising to the surface. And once you know that, you stop letting memory steer your life. You begin to speak the things you once hid, You allow yourself to need someone without feeling ashamed. You let emotions flow without tightening them, without swallowing them down. You breathe at your own rhythm again, not the rhythm you once had to adapt to. And slowly, you feel something strange. You are no longer driven by the things that once frightened you. You are no longer living by reflex. You are beginning to live by choice. The pain doesn't disappear. It simply no longer holds power. It stands beside you as part of your history, not as the one holding the wheel. And in that quiet, you understand, freedom is not the absence of wounds. Freedom is when the wounds no longer decide who you are. There comes an ordinary morning when you wake up and no longer feel your heart as heavy as before. Not because all your wounds have vanished, but because you're no longer fighting them. They rest there like pieces that have finally found their place. No more scraping, no more screaming for attention, no more demanding to be fixed right away. They simply exist, quietly, and for the first time, you feel quiet with them. You realize the past doesn't need to be erased for you to feel lighter. It only needs to be set down in the right place, not blocking your path, not gripping your shoulders, not whispering instructions at every step like it once did. It stands behind you now, not in front of you like a chapter that has been read, not disappeared, but no longer dictating how you write the next one. You begin to notice small shifts in the way you respond to things. What once sent you into panic now only makes you pause for a moment. The silences that once terrified you no longer cast such a long shadow. The careless words that once stung now pass by like a brief breeze. Not because you've become numb, but because you understand where the fear comes from. And once you understand it, it no longer has the power to control you. You walk more slowly, but more truthfully. You love more cautiously, but more deeply. You speak less, but more clearly. And for the first time, you feel within you a space for peace. A peace you once believed you didn't deserve. You also begin to see the two selves that have lived inside you. The child who feared being left behind, and the adult who strained to never disappoint anyone. In the past, these two fought constantly. One wanted to run, the other wanted to hold everything together. But today, you sense them sitting beside each other, without fighting, without blaming. They simply look at one another like two pieces of a life, finally placed where they belong. You no longer force yourself to be strong all the time. You no longer see asking for help as a sign of weakness. You no longer live to reassure others before reassuring yourself. You still fear, still worry, still have days when your heart feels thin, but you no longer run from any of it. And from that pause, your heart begins to widen. You understand that freedom isn't walking without burdens, but knowing what once bound you and choosing not to let it bind you again. You understand that healing isn't becoming someone new, but returning to who you were before life required you to change shape. You understand that happiness isn't the absence of pain, but the absence of fear when touching that pain. And standing in this moment between what once broke you and what now invites you forward, you recognize the gentlest truth of this journey. You did not just survive, you were reborn, not through an explosion, but through the quiet choice you make every day, the choice to never abandon yourself again. And in that serenity, you know that the life ahead finally belongs to you.